Hey everybody, welcome to week 8. Let me get right into it. So, coming up on March 16th, which is not the end of this week, the end of week 9 though, um, is part 3 of your project will be due. That is the part where you talk about policy alternatives and how you evaluate them. So, your selection criteria. So this week's lecture, when you look at the week ahead of this and the next one, this seems a little bit out of order for me to be talking about evaluation criteria when we're still talking about tools of analysis. But I wanted to offer this week really to help you prep for that part 3 of the project. So evaluative criteria, it talks about this in Craft in chapter 6. So what are these? Well, really, at the outset, think of policy analysis in the same way that you think about decision making. Um, Creating a policy is a lot like the decision making process. And so you're really trying to decide between alternatives, which is just something that we do when we make common decisions, right? An evaluative criteria is the standard upon which you make comparisons. So if we're just talking about decisions, how do you decide whether you're going to go out with your friends to go to a movie, or out with your friends to go out to eat or for drinks, or stay home and read your textbooks? So how do you evaluate those choices, right? You have to have some basis of comparison. So the evaluative criteria are those standards. And so included in that are the key aspects or the factors that you do examine, right? So economists will tell you that you will decide on whatever brings you the most marginal utility, right? So that's the factor that you're looking at. Which one brings me the most utility? And you evaluate choices by applying that same criteria, whatever they are, for your decision, or for, in our case, the given policy problems, to the alternatives, the several alternatives that are being proposed. So again, policy decisions and decisions in your everyday life or decisions in organizations really follow some of the same kinds of thinking. So this is the chart that is seen in chapter 6 of Craft. And so what they're talking about here is these several 8 or 9 different criteria for evaluating public policy decisions. So what are they saying? What they're saying is there's different angles from which you can look at the proposal. Effectiveness, efficiency, equity, liberty and freedom, political feasibility, social acceptability, administrative feasibility, and technical feasibility. So what are these things? We're going to get to these more in a second, but basically what you take from this chart is that these several criteria differ, and the way that you would look at a policy decision, the criteria for judgment are going to be different. It's not that some of these are rational and some of these are irrational or non-rational necessarily. It's that they are just different ways of actually judging the policy proposal. So let me get more into that. So often the way you evaluate things might depend on your orientation, right? And so this comes from Clemens and Macbeth. I gave you chapter 2, I believe, of Clemens and Macbeth to read for this week. This comes from chapter 4. But basically what they're talking about in chapter 4 is that everyone kind of carries around a different ontology, which is your belief in how the world works, and a different epistemology, which is essentially your belief in how you learn things. So we have these 3 kind of simplistic orientations, right? Positivism, postmodernism, and postpositivism. So positivism, the essential ontology there, probably shouldn't use the word essential, but the basic ontology there is that in positivism there's really only non-metaphysical facts, right? And we can find an objective reality outside of our own experience. So the epistemology means that the way we learn facts is we can study things in a fair and neutral way. So really, the best kind of research, given this epistemology, uses a scientific method that follows kind of the natural science approach to research, including deductive reasoning and hypothesis testing through statistical techniques. And so really our goal is generalization of research. And so this is why in medical research, for example, we see very careful sampling techniques being used, very careful measures taken to ensure objectivity, such as double-blind tests. And the goal of medical research, in most cases, really is to generalize across the illness, for example. So cancer research is trying to generalize results to a particular form of cancer, for example. And that is why you see studies testing other studies and then testing those again to understand whether the results really are consistent for that type of cancer, for example. Okay, so postmodernism on the other side is that there is generally this denial of universal truths and meta-narratives. So truth and meaning are found in particular communities of belief. And so we discover truth, our epistemology, through deconstruction of language, and where we're looking for contradictions and assumptions. And so generalization becomes difficult, if not impossible. But somewhere in the middle of those two is post-positivism, where we understand that the world isn't just physical, but also socially constructed, right? So humans construct a world of intersubjective reality, meaning that the way we understand our social arrangements is often through institutions and traditions that we have constructed socially over time. And so we can often discover that through qualitative methods like field research or content analysis or focus groups with some generalization, but also we can discover that through more quantitative means as well. And so the point is that a lot of people have different ontologies. However, if you ask me, my opinion is that we should be methodological ecumenalists, if you will. I think that personally, I think that all research designs have more to do with the research question than they have to do with a particular researcher's ontology. So the question is public administration a science, right? I mean, we've called it the science of public administration. So you go back to your PA 8050 course, and we talked about this thing called the politics administration dichotomy, right? Woodrow Wilson, Goodnow, those people who said that politics takes place in one arena and administration takes place in a different arena, whereby administrators can use more rational methods to carry out policies that were created in the political process, even if the political process is full of all kinds of things like deal making and compromise. We can still come up with rational ways of implementing policy. But what Dahl asked in 1947 was how do we separate facts from values? In other words, Dahl was asking, don't we always insert our values into our implementation? But be that as it may, rationalism has really found its way into our implementation of policy, right? So if you look at some of the work of Radin, she wrote that book I had you read an excerpt from, um, Machiavelli coming of age. So, the introduction of planning, programming, and budgeting in the Department of Defense in the early 1960s, and then pushing that kind of thinking to the rest of the federal government, um, was really an exercise in rationalism, because Robert McNamara believed that quantitative techniques should really be used as the basis of analysis in the DoD. And so Clemens and Macbeth, though, actually in their book contend that McNamara wasn't as rational as people think, that values were smuggled into the conduct of the Vietnam War. But at any rate, if when we talk about rationalism, here's what we hope to achieve with a classic rational approach. So for one thing, the comprehensive rational approach is a decision-making model, right? This is where we define the problem, where we gather sufficient data and expert analysis, where we operationalize goals so they can be achievable and prioritized. We list alternatives and possible courses of action. We develop criteria for evaluation, and we evaluate these equally, and then we select the preferred alternative. So actually, this sounds like your policy analysis, right? It also sounds like a dissertation or a thesis. So the classic 5 chapters of a thesis or a dissertation are the introduction, where you say, hey, this is what I'm going to talk about. The literature review, which is, this is what the experts say. The methodology, which talks about, this is how I will discover the truth relatively of what I am testing. So I'm going to use this kind of methodology. I'm going to use these kinds of criteria to judge my hypotheses. And the findings, how did my hypothesis respond to my methodological tests? And the conclusions, right? So now what do I have to say about this after all that testing? So really, in a sense, we construct a framework for our analysis that really resembles the comprehensive rational decision-making model. And I think that's an excellent way to do it, because it gives us a common vocabulary that we can employ when we analyze policy. So in a sense, when we've all heard of cost-benefit analysis, we're going to talk about that a little more next week. In a sense, cost-benefit analysis is something like a poster of rational analysis, right? So what cost-benefit analysis tells us is that we can compare policies, say policy 1 and its costs and benefits against policy 2 and its costs and benefits, and we can put them on something like this scale here, and we can see which one outweighs the other. So what cost-benefit analysis gives us is a completely rational statement of all the costs, all the benefits, and we apply something like a discount rate over time so that we can understand basically the ratio of benefits over costs, or costs over benefits, however we want to state it. And so we have this ratio and these dollar figures that tell us the best policy alternative. And that's true. So, but what becomes a little bit less than rational in that exercise is the way in which we monetize benefits and the way in which we monetize costs. And we'll have more to say about that next week. So, I noticed that I mentioned, I should say, that Clemens and Macbeth criticized the idea that McNamara in the DoD was being completely too rational. And so a lot of critics actually have said that one of the reasons the United States failed in Vietnam was that McNamara was overly rational and overly quantitative and didn't take into account certain social factors or political factors that were going on in Vietnam. However, what they contend, and with some reason, is that McNamara might have actually smuggled in some non-rational thinking in his rationality. So, for example, the reason we got into Vietnam in the first place was basically a fear of communism as a rival dominant philosophy, right? Capitalism versus communism. And so this idea of a domino theory that became popular post World War II and in the 1950s was that if uh, states like South Vietnam fall, or not South Vietnam, but all of Vietnam and Indochina fall to communism, then it will lead to nearby states falling to communism, and it becomes like the falling dominoes. And pretty soon, all of Asia is communist. But that's not really a rational thought. That was a philosophy. Um, Not from Clemens and Macbeth, but one that actually was apparent in Vietnam, was something that was disguised as rationality, and that was that McNamara insisted on body counts, literally. So anytime the U.S. was engaged in an engagement with the enemy, the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, um, the army, the Marines, whoever was doing the fighting had to report on body counts. They had to like count how many dead enemy were out there. And the thinking was that there's only so many of the enemy, and if we kill them all, we don't have to kill them all. We get to a tipping point beyond which they can't produce any more fighting bodies. Of course, the problem with body count was that in addition to it wasn't always accurately measured, we made assumptions about who was actually doing fighting for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. We assumed it was young men, and in actuality, it was more of a total war effort. And so, if war is only partly rational and partly political, so what about other wars that we fight in the social world, like Johnson's War on Poverty, which was going on at the same time? Or what do we think about current so-called wars that we're fighting, i.e., the war on opioid addiction? So these problems that we have are partly ideological and partly rational. And sometimes we smuggle in things like ideology, wishful thinking, into supposedly rational decision-making models. So how else do you explain, for example, the building of sports and multi-purpose arenas in cities? The Ralston Arena near Omaha is a great example where, most people would contend that a lot of wishful thinking was smuggled into the analysis of whether the Ralston Arena would actually become profitable, or policies on economic development. So all to say that rationality and non-rationality sometimes work together. I think we just have to stand back and realize that that is actually the case. So what are some non-rational explanations for how things work or how policy should be explained? There's a few of them. So there's group theory, right? Um, the size of a group and its wealth might result in more access and influence than one might expect, right? So Madison, the kind of classical Madisonian approach is interest group liberalism, right? So Madison argued that ambition should be made to counteract ambition, and that factions will battle against each other, but in the end, we achieve some kind of balance. But group theory tells us that no, balance doesn't necessarily always happen, right? So in our gun control debates, many people argue that the National Rifle Association has sort of an outsized influence. The National Rifle Association basically would argue, no, we have an appropriate amount of influence just like any other group, and we have opportunities for access just like any other group. And then there's incrementalism. So this goes way back to Lindblom in 1959, where he argued that our political system basically muddles through. He used that term. And actually, Lindblom argued that incrementalism really is a normative and not just an empirical approach that he observed, but that's really how we should do things, because we should when it comes to budgets, for example, what we should desire are incremental increases per year, and that might suboptimize, but it will also not take away in unreasonable ways. And then there's elite theory, which elite theory is non-rational because what it tells you is that really just a few elites make the decisions, and so their decisions might not be rational, but they're the elites and they're in charge. That goes all the way back to Plato. I mean, this is why Plato argued that the best kind of government was aristocracy, because the elites really were smarter, and not only were they smarter, but they were also virtuous, and so they would produce the best results for the polis. So are there other kind of non-rational explanations? Yeah, so there's institutional explanations, where institutions in our government or elsewhere actually might resist or promote policy change for self-supporting reasons. There are theories about coalition advocacy, where coalitions are formed to affect policy change. External crises may cause policy change, and the policy that is changed, the changes might not actually be rational. And so the question is, can there be such a thing as evidence-based policymaking? Remember going back to Paul Kearney, but I mean, I would contend that yes, there is evidence-based policymaking, but like Professor Kearney says, we should be aware that the evidence often gets in sort of the meat grinder of the political process. So, what are some of the problems we have, given that we have different criteria for analyzing policy? So first, a lot of these are also in the Clemens and Macbeth text in chapter 4, which I'm not having you read. So I'll just go through these really quickly. But the first problem are intellectual and analytical critiques. So first we have the human problem, right? We are humans, and we're not as rational as we believe we are. So often we use models and metaphors, and I would say narratives, to impose our structure on the world and provide it with a frame of reference. And so this is how we explain what's going on in the world. And often, quite often, those narratives find their way into policy. So when we were looking at the statements of intent from the Nebraska legislature, a couple of you mentioned this bill to put the official national motto of the United States, "In God We Trust," in school classrooms. The bill says that, this will be, I don't know, posted somewhere in classrooms and on schools, right? Okay, so I would contend that responds to a particular ontology or particular narrative about how the world works. And by the way, I'm not criticizing that narrative. I'm just saying I think it responds to a particular narrative that says the problem with our educational system is that we have taken knowledge of the Almighty out of public education. Okay, so what that is saying is that, we do use narratives really to inject them into policy. That's one example. We can think of others. And then there's the analytical problem. And actually, the thing I like about the Bardach book is really the Bardach's point of view is that time is limited. And so all analysis is not going to be perfect. So because problems are complex and time is limited, we often emphasize short-term thinking at the expense of long-term thinking. So that's not necessarily good, but that's what we do. So we see this problem in we can't always analyze budgets very well, and so we do think of budgets in, okay, so what did the last year's budget do? How do we want this year's budget to look, and how does that budget extend into the next say 2 to 5 years, right? That's our time horizon often in budgeting. That's what Lindblom was talking about when he talked about incrementalism. So in other words, we can't really necessarily project a budget out 10 years, even though the CBO does do that for the national budget. It becomes more difficult for us to apply that kind of analysis. So there's cognitive critiques, and this is really what, in a sense, this is kind of what we're going through in our current discourse, I would contend. There is evidence that humans like to think tribally, and we do fall into camps, right? And so liberal or conservative, that's one of the way of describing at least two of the camps. There's more camps than those. So we're very good at detecting when the other side cheats, ascribing poor motives to them. Some people call this the devilship. That's what Sabatier and Jenkins Smith called it when they wrote about the Advocacy Coalition framework. That is, that we think that the other side really has the worst of intentions. And so we're often prepared to accept the views of people who affirm ours and reject the views of people who go against ours. And so we've even built now in our public discourse our favorite cable television networks, where we don't even really have to listen to the views of the other side, if you will. And then we have political and institutional critiques, right? And so the nature of the political system is such that we have this fragmentation. As a matter of fact, I would argue really that our separation of power system was built in a sense to actually be fragmented. We are not a parliamentary system in the United States. In fact, we don't actually believe in parliamentary systems where the chief executive, if you will, the prime minister, comes from the legislative branch and is in effect the chief legislator and also the chief administrator. The closest thing to that in the United States is the council manager system in some cities, whereby the elected city council hires an administrator, if you will. You could call that person the prime minister, who carries out essentially the vision of the council, but does it in such a way that manager applies professionalism and expertise to the wishes of the council. And so in that kind of arrangement, the presidential or mayoral or gubernatorial executive is really not in that picture. But the nature of our political system in general is separation of powers. And so it leads to some of that. And then there's the nature of the organization. So decision makers themselves are often, they're guided by standard operating procedures that tend to create or enhance or perpetuate organizational cultures, behavior patterns, and decision preferences. So different organizations have different interests in policy, and they're doing that through the lens of their culture often, right? So in the US government even, we can see conflict between organizations due to organizational culture. So the USDA has different kinds of interests than, say, the Bureau of Land Management, and these often come into conflict. And then there's ideological and philosophical critiques and problems that we run into in policy analysis, right? So one is, what's the data and who's using it? So experts and analysis, they're not exempt from bias, right? So not in my backyard kind of thinking does reflect the realities and costs that aren't spread equally across society. And so what we see often, we have to be careful in policy analysis, is that people use facts differently or omit facts differently. We have to be careful of the way people use statistics or dress them up or make charts and graphs or use adjectives. You know, we have to be careful about using when people use absolute numbers, dollar figures or populations or others, and when they use percentages. And we have to understand what's being said. And then there is a subjective impact, right? So subjectivity is often smuggled into our analysis, even when we're not wanting it to be. So back to craft, right? Back to this. Your criteria might be a result of the way you view the world. But let's talk about these 8 or 9 different criteria and how they play out in analysis. So first of all, we do invoke criteria for every decision, right? Policy decisions are complicated, so the criteria help you focus on what's important, and they help organize your thinking. Using criteria does lead to better decisions. But on that chart, that table there, 6.1, is different decisions have different criteria. So some things will lend themselves to cost-benefit analysis. Some things will lend themselves to an analysis that looks at equity. Some things will lend themselves to an analysis that looks at technical specifications. And the decision criteria, in any case, really should be demonstrable and measurable, right? Even if you're using more of a standard like equity, how would you show equity? How would you demonstrate the differences in equity between different alternatives that you have for a policy decision? You have to actually be able to demonstrate them. So what are these things? So the first one in that table, in figure, I should say, 6.1 is effectiveness. Effectiveness is simple, right? Effectiveness says, did the policy work? Right? Did the policy work? Did it achieve its outcome goals? So operational measures that define effectiveness should be laid out, right? Or an estimate of the likelihood of this thing working. So here's an example. What does effective foreign policy look like? You know, what goals are the United States trying to achieve with its foreign policy? Is something we're arguing about right now, really. Is internationalism better than isolationism? Or is isolationism better than internationalism? Really, in a sense, the United States has argued about that for much longer. But, you know, at least since the end of World War II, we've had a foreign policy that was really founded in internationalism and collective security. But does that necessarily work better than you know, a policy that avoids entangling alliances and a policy that leans more on a strong United States that does not need collective security? So how would you measure that kind of effectiveness? That's a question. And then there's efficiency, which could be thought of as one step beyond effectiveness, but it's a different kind of measure. So efficiency is often seen as the most important criteria. Efficiency really is the highest amount of inputs from one unit, the highest amount of outputs, I should say, from one unit of input. So, you know, energy efficiency, for example, is you are getting the most amount of heat, for example, or cooling from a unit of gas or a unit of electricity, right? So we know that a house is energy inefficient when the heat leaks out of windows, when it leaks out of thresholds of doors, when the forced air system doesn't distribute the heat in a proper manner, So it's not efficient because we're using more inputs to get the same value of heating in the house if those things were working better, right? So efficient policy works well at a low cost. So let me go back to another military example or foreign policy example. Um, Way back when in 1962, Milton Friedman, who was, you've probably heard of him, famous economist, but more of the libertarian bent from the University of Chicago. Um, Milton Friedman wrote this book called Capitalism and Freedom in 1962, and he talked about this a wide array of subjects. One of the subjects he talked about was conscription, that is the draft, the military draft. He called, this was 1962, so before we really started fighting with each other nationally about Vietnam, um, he called conscription a tax on the poor. So what did he mean by that? He meant that while the force structure model for the military that was in effect then, so what the force structure model that was in effect for the military then was kind of a hybrid of professional volunteers and draftees. And so the way that worked was um, the United States conscripted people into the army, um, and then people volunteered to join the other services. But basically, what that allowed was the military services to pay first term enlistees at a very low rate, right? So most of these were young men, they weren't married, um, and they were drafted into the army, for example, and they got paid very poorly. But then again, they didn't really need to be paid great, right? Because they all lived in the barracks, they didn't need cars, they didn't have all these creature comforts, right? So this was thought to be efficient. But so Milton basically argued that it was a deception of efficiency because he said really what you're doing is you're paying a high economic cost, and that's inefficient for the nation. And what he meant by that was that we took these young men, many of them were poor, and so we didn't actually enable ourselves to educate these people better, where later they might more effectively contribute to the workforce in the nation. And so basically we're taxing them in a sense um, for having no other options. And so Milton Friedman said that all of the military should be an all volunteer force. Again, this was in 1962. Well, it turns out Friedman actually served on the commission. It's called the Gates Commission, that in 1970 really wrote the proposal for an all volunteer force that the Nixon administration put into effect. And this actually was a result of two things: the all volunteer force, the divisive experience of Vietnam, but also the thinking of Friedman that we have this inefficiency disguised as efficiency. But there's way less dramatic examples of efficiency as a public policy kind of criterion. And that is, for example, it might be more efficient for a city to contract trash pickup versus retaining in-house, versus the city owning all the trash trucks, paying their wages and having their personnel system apply to the people that drive the trash trucks. It might just be more efficient to hire a contractor to do trash pickup. And so we see efficiency as a value in public policy because often it does bring about better service for a lower cost. And then there's equity on that chart. So what is equity? Equity really is the fairness in the distribution of costs and benefits and risks across the population. So often we think about equity when we're talking about redistributive policies, right? Is this fair? But we also talk about equity a lot in our tax systems, right? I have a link there that you can get to from the PowerPoint version of this. It's way back from 2012. It's a CNN interview with an economist who at the time was proposing that we tax wealth, not income. So there's a difference, right? Income is just the money that you get from various sources during the year, but wealth is what you accumulate over time. And so his contention was that we should tax wealth. Well, in fact, we don't do that necessarily. we tax income, but our income tax system really is built as a progressive and marginal bracket system because we're trying to answer, at least in part, the equity question. So this is, I took this from H&R Block. So this is the tax brackets in effect, right, for this year. So as you know, and I think you all know this, you don't, we don't really pay, 37% tax or 32% tax or 10% tax on all of our income, right? There have been proposals in the past during presidential campaigns to have a flat rate income tax, for example, whereby everybody pays 9% or 12% on all of their income. But that's not how our income tax works, right? So the 12% bracket, for example, of someone, a single filer, they're paying 12% on all their income that is from $9,525 all the way up to almost $38,700. So $37,699. On all that money, they're paying 12%. And then they're paying 22% on the money above $38,700 all the way up to $82,499. And then they're paying 24%. And so these graduated tax brackets actually are progressive tax, and they're in these marginal brackets because this is designed to provide some sort of equity. So therefore, people at lower incomes pay a lower percent of tax. People in higher brackets, they're paying a higher percent on that marginal income that is in those brackets. So it's not as if the person who earns $200,000 is paying 35% on all their income. They're only paying 35% on the part of it that's between $157,500 and $200,000, right? So you all know that, but the point is that actually is an attempt to apply equity to income tax. So there's others that are on that chart, right? So political feasibility. That comes in handy all the time, right? Can this proposal, this policy actually pass the appropriate legislative body and gain approval from the applicable executive, right? So, I mean, people in legislative bodies, Congress or the Nebraska legislature or the city council can propose policy till they're blue in the face, but if it's not going to pass the body, then it's not politically feasible. And so often political feasibility is sometimes criticized, right? Oh, you shouldn't have compromised on this principle. Well, yes, but on the other hand, there's the argument that, well, if you hadn't compromised on this principle, there would be nothing. And then there's social acceptability. So will the public support whatever this policy is? There's technical feasibility. So, I mean, are technologies available to implement the policy, and can it actually be done? It wasn't necessarily a policy, it was an aspirational goal that President Kennedy, said, we're going to land a man on the moon in this decade. When he said that, some people thought it wasn't technically feasible, but it was technically feasible. It required a lot of effort. So sometimes technical feasibility really is an important aspect of policy. There's at least one student writing on police-worn body cameras. So body-worn cameras that police now use in many jurisdictions. So, one of the issues with body-worn cameras has to do with technical feasibility. And particularly not the camera itself, but the storage of the data. Is that technically feasible? And actually, is it cost feasible? And so that bleeds into administrative feasibility, right? So yes, we can put body-worn cameras on all police officers. Every single police officer can have a body-worn camera. But when we get to administrative feasibility, then we have to start talking about what's the effort required in terms of servers, in terms of IT personnel that we have to pay now, in terms of cloud storage. So is it administratively feasible? And a great example of maybe an administrative feasibility issue was when the Affordable Care Act rolled out. We had healthcare.gov that crashed right away. But that didn't mean the ACA was administratively infeasible. It was probably more a failure of administrators themselves to actually design the software to actually meet the demand. So all this leads to the discussion of the week. And actually, I need you to go to the discussion itself because this is not it. It's a lot longer. I'm going back to my tried and true example of Social Security because I think Social Security just gives us so much fodder to examine policy that it's good for us to all use it together. What I'd like you to do this week really is, and read the discussion, is use one or two of these criteria listed in that chart to suggest an analysis that you might do of various alternatives for Social Security. And to do that, I'm going to ask you to go back to the week 4 document that I gave you from the Congressional Budget Office, wherein they offer several alternatives for fixing, if you will, Social Security. So read the discussion, and I think you'll understand where I'm coming from. And I'm kind of looking forward to how you guys talk about analyzing policy through various criteria. So there's the references. Thanks again, and I look forward to your discussion.